My name is Skylar Sterling. I am 29 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been the invisible ghost haunting the corridors of Sterling Oceanic. Today was supposed to be the day the world finally acknowledged the weight of my labor. But as I sat in the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower in downtown Seattle, the air tasted of expensive cologne and systematic betrayal. My brother, Julian, leaned back in a mahogany chair that cost more than my first 3 years of salary combined, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, condescending beat against the glass surface of the table. "Skylar, don't look so surprised. Dad always knew you were better suited for the mailroom than the boardroom," he sneered, his voice dripping with the unearned arrogance of a man who had never worked a day in his 32 years of life. With a flick of his wrist, he slid a cheap $12 ballpoint pen across the polished surface toward me, a plastic insult offered in a room filled with gold-nibbed fountain pens. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the sheer weight of the resentment sitting in my chest, you have to understand what Sterling Oceanic is and what I have sacrificed to keep it afloat. While Julian was busy crashing 60-foot Sunseeker yachts in Monaco and charging the $500,000 repairs to the company's auxiliary accounts, I was stationed in the humid, windowless offices of our logistics hub in Savannah, Georgia. I wasn't just an employee, I was the person calculating fuel logistics down to the last 4 cents per gallon, ensuring that our fleet of 22 Neo-Panamax cargo ships avoided the peak congestion surcharges at the port of Long Beach. I knew the exact cost of a replacement crankshaft for a MAN B&W 2-stroke engine and the precise interest rates on our mezzanine financing. I was the backbone, the silent engineer of a $150 million empire, while my brother was nothing more than a polished hood ornament. The room smelled of stale coffee and the sharp metallic scent of the Pacific Northwest rain hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the Seattle skyline was draped in a gray shroud, the Space Needle poking through the mist like a needle in a haystack. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder. My father, Marcus Sterling, had been buried exactly 10 days ago. The funeral had been a grand, performative affair at St. James Cathedral, costing upwards of $85,000, complete with a professional choir and enough white lilies to suffocate a greenhouse. Julian had played the part of the grieving heir perfectly, dabbing his eyes with a silk pocket square while I stood in the back, checking the morning's freight indices on my phone because the world of international trade doesn't stop for a funeral, not even for the man who built it. Now, we were gathered for the reading of the supplemental directives. The primary will had already been executed, leaving the bulk of the liquid assets and the family estate in Mercer Island to Julian, as expected. But there was a final envelope, a heavy, cream-colored vessel made of 100-pound cardstock, held together by a 30-year-old red wax seal that bore the Sterling family crest, a stylized anchor entwined with a serpent. This was the document my father had mentioned only once, on a night when the Scotch had loosened his tongue and his eyes had grown cloudy with a rare, fleeting moment of lucidity. Julian looked at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He adjusted his charcoal Brioni suit, a 3-piece masterpiece that cost $6,000, and checked his Patek Philippe Nautilus, a watch that currently traded for over $100,000 on the secondary market. He was the golden boy, the favored son who had been given everything and appreciated nothing. I, on the other hand, was wearing a sensible $200 navy blazer from Nordstrom and carrying a battered leather satchel I'd used since my freshman year at MIT. The family attorney, Arthur Penhaligon, a man whose skin looked like weathered parchment and whose eyes had seen every sordid Sterling secret for 4 decades, cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, bouncing off the original 1920s oil paintings of our seafaring ancestors. Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the letter. He didn't use a silver letter opener. He simply stared at the waxed seal, his expression unreadable, a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction. Julian's laughter was a sharp, grating sound. "Come on, Arthur, let's get this over with. Skylar has some mail to sort, and I have a flight to Cabo at 4 o'clock. The Gulfstream G650 is already fueled up and waiting at Boeing Field. I've got the 150 million, the title of CEO, and the keys to the kingdom. What could that dusty old letter possibly change? He reached out and tapped the red wax with his index finger, his touch careless and disrespectful. I felt the weight of every late night I'd spent in the warehouse, every missed birthday, every holiday spent reconciling the accounts while Julian was photographed with models on the French Riviera. I remembered the time I had to personally negotiate a labor dispute in the port of Rotterdam while my father and Julian were at the Masters in Augusta, spending $40,000 on hospitality packages. The injustice of it wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical ache, a dull throb in my temples that synchronized with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the boardroom. Arthur finally broke the seal. The sound of the wax snapping was like a bone breaking in a silent room. He unfolded the paper, which was yellowed at the edges but remarkably well preserved. He began to read in a voice that was low and steady, yet possessed a gravity that pulled the oxygen out of the room. The letter was dated July 14, 1994, the day after my mother had passed away in a tragic car accident on the rainy slopes of the Olympic Peninsula. To my executors and my children, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I have finally succumbed to the pride that defined my life. I have spent decades building a legacy based on the assumption of blood and loyalty, but truth is a debt that always comes due with interest. Many years ago, I made a choice to protect the Sterling name at the expense of the Sterling soul. Julian rolled his eyes, leaning forward to grab the $12 pen he'd tossed at me as if he intended to doodle on the priceless mahogany table. Get to the point, Arthur. We don't need a philosophy lesson from a dead man. Arthur didn't look up. He simply turned the page and continued. In the matter of the succession of Sterling Oceanic, I hereby declare a condition precedent that was omitted from the primary will for reasons of absolute discretion. 30 years ago, a private investigation was conducted following the birth of my first son, Julian. The results, held in the vault of the First National Bank under File 78-Bravo, confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Julian Sterling is not of my biological line. He was the product of a brief indiscretion my late wife had during our first year of marriage. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the hum of the server racks in the next room. Julian's hand froze mid-air. The smug bronze glow of his tan seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sickly pale gray. His face was rapidly turning the color of a cheap, overcooked steak, a mottled purple-red that clashed horribly with his expensive suit. Arthur's voice grew even colder as he delivered the final blow. Therefore, per the bylaws of the Sterling Trust established in 1964, only a direct biological descendant may inherit the voting shares and the controlling interest of the company. In the event that no male heir exists, the entirety of the $150 million estate, including all maritime assets, real estate holdings, and the Sterling Oceanic CEO position, shall pass immediately and irrevocably to my daughter, Skylar Sterling. Julian's breath hitched. He tried to speak, but the only sound that came out was a pathetic, wet wheeze. He looked down at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. The $150 million inheritance, the life of luxury, the power he had used as a bludgeon against me for my entire life, it was all dissolving like salt in a storm. He wasn't the heir. He was a stranger who had been living on borrowed time and stolen money. I looked at the $12 ballpoint pen still sitting on the table between us. I reached out, my fingers steady and cool, and I picked it up. I didn't feel a rush of joy. I felt a profound sense of realignment, as if the universe had finally clicked into its proper gear. I looked my brother in the eye, the man who had called me a mailroom clerk, and I saw the terror of a person who realized he had never actually learned how to survive without a silver spoon in his mouth. Now let me take you back to the damp, salt-crusted docks of Savannah 3 years ago, when I was working 18-hour shifts to cover for Julian's incompetence, because that is where the real work of a CEO begins. It wasn't about the yachts or the champagne. It was about the grit, the numbers, and the relentless pursuit of a truth that I knew would eventually set me free. My name is Skylar Sterling, and I am no longer the invisible backbone. I am the head of the empire, and the first thing I'm going to do is change the locks on the boardroom door. The weight of the crown is heavy, but I have been carrying the weight of this company on my shoulders for a decade. I am practiced in the art of heavy lifting. Family isn't just a name you inherit or a bloodline you claim. It is the integrity you show when no one is watching and the resilience you build when you are being pushed into the shadows. As I looked out at the rain-streaked windows, I knew that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one I was about to unleash on the legacy of the Sterling name. The red wax was broken, the secrets were out, and for the first time in 29 years, I could finally breathe. The financial gap between my existence and my brother's was not just a difference in bank balances, but a vast, echoing canyon that defined every waking second of our lives within the Sterling dynasty. While I was waking up at 4 a.m. to the sharp, insistent chirping of a generic alarm clock, my brother, Preston, was likely just returning to his penthouse in a state of expensive disarray. Preston didn't just drive a car, he piloted a custom-ordered 2026 Porsche 911 Turbo Ace, finished in a blinding, aggressive shade of shark blue, a vehicle that had a sticker price of $230,000 before he added another $40,000 in bespoke interior options. Every time he pulled into the executive parking garage of Sterling Oceanic, the roar of that flat-six engine seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the building, a mechanical scream of dominance that made my teeth ache. He would step out of that machine wearing a Vacheron Constantine Overseas Perpetual Calendar on his wrist, a timepiece crafted from 18-karat pink gold that cost more than the 3-bedroom starter house I had been saving for since I turned 21. In stark, humiliating contrast, I arrived at work in a 2016 Toyota Corolla with 114,000 miles on the odometer and a prominent, jagged dent in the rear bumper from a hit-and-run in a grocery store parking lot 3 years ago. I didn't have the $3,000 to spare for the bodywork because every cent of my salary was funneled into my own quiet investments and the grueling upkeep of a life my father refused to subsidize. When I walked through the lobby, my shoes didn't click with the authority of Italian leather. Instead, I wore a $120 suit I had scrounged from a clearance rack at the Macy's in the Alderwood Mall, the polyester blend slightly itchy against my skin in the summer humidity. I was the Chief Operations Liaison, a title that sounded impressive to outsiders, but essentially meant I was the person who worked 90-hour weeks to ensure the Sterling fortune didn't evaporate due to Preston's gross negligence. My daily reality was a relentless grind of logistics and crisis management, where I personally oversaw a fleet of 14 massive cargo ships, including our flagship vessel, the Sterling Titan. I knew the specific draft of every hull and the exact fuel consumption rates for our routes between Shanghai and the port of Tacoma. While Preston's only significant contribution to the family business was deciding which $800 bottle of Louis Roederer Cristal to crack open at 2 p.m. to celebrate a deal he hadn't actually closed, I was staring at 3 different monitors, tracking global oil prices and calculating the precise impact of a 2-cent increase in maritime diesel. I lived in the world of spreadsheets, port fees, and labor contracts, managing a budget that exceeded $400 million annually, yet I was treated like a glorified secretary who was simply playing house in a skyscraper. My father, Barnaby Sterling, was a man of prehistoric sensibilities who looked at my meticulously detailed analytical reports as if they were finger paintings brought home from kindergarten. He would sit at the head of the mahogany conference table, his silver hair perfectly coiffed by a barber who charged $250 per session, and literally push my folders aside to listen to Preston ramble about a tech startup he wanted to invest in. Barnaby would chuckle, patting Preston on the shoulder of his $4,000 Tom Ford Blazer, and tell him what a visionary he was, while I stood there in my clearance rack suit holding the data that proved the startup was a blatant Ponzi scheme. My father referred to my 10 years of grueling service as a hobby for a girl, a phrase that felt like a deliberate slap to the face every time it left his lips. He believed that women were meant to be ornaments, perhaps useful for charity galas or interior design, but certainly not for navigating the cutthroat waters of international shipping. The injustice of it was a constant, simmering heat beneath my skin, especially when I looked at the actual numbers. Preston's lifestyle was a black hole of company resources. I had the records showing he had billed the auxiliary maritime account for over $1.2 million in travel and entertainment in the last fiscal year alone. That included a six-figure weekend in Las Vegas, where he stayed in the Sky Villa at the Palms, and a private jet charter to Ibiza that cost $85,000 because he didn't want to fly first class on a commercial airline like a commoner. Meanwhile, I was denied a request for a $10,000 software upgrade that would have streamlined our customs clearance process and saved the company nearly $500,000 in annual port stay penalties. My father had looked me dead in the eye and told me we needed to be fiscally responsible, then turned around and handed Preston the keys to a new 2025 Range Rover autobiography because the Porsche was apparently too cramped for weekend trips to the Hamptons. I remember one specific Tuesday in October when the rain was lashing against the windows of my cramped office, the one tucked away near the service elevator while Preston had the corner suite with the panoramic view of Elliott Bay. I was dealing with a mechanical failure on the Sterling Mariner, which was currently stranded 300 miles off the coast of Hawaii with $40 million worth of perishable electronics on board. The cost of a deep-sea tug and the subsequent loss of contract value was mounting by the second, roughly $1,200 for every hour we remained stationary. I had been on the phone with salvage experts and insurance adjusters for 14 hours straight, my eyes bloodshot and my head pounding from the fluorescent lights. I finally managed to negotiate a reduced standby rate and secured a secondary vessel to offload the most critical cargo, a move that saved the company nearly $3 million in potential lawsuits. Exhausted but proud, I walked into my father's office to brief him on the resolution, hoping that for once he might see the value I brought to the table. Instead, I found him and Preston huddled over a tablet, looking at photos of a vintage 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO that was coming up for auction. Barnaby didn't even look up when I started explaining the logistics of the salvage operation. He just raised a hand to silence me and said, "Not now, Skylar. Your brother and I are discussing a real investment." Preston smirked at me, his eyes mocking as he adjusted the sleeves of his cashmere sweater. "Yeah, Sky, don't worry your pretty little head about the boats. Go grab us some of those artisanal sandwiches from the deli downstairs, would you?" The bill at that deli for 3 people was usually around $95, a sum that Preston would toss onto the company card without a second thought, while I carefully packed my brown bag lunch of turkey and Swiss every single morning to save the $7. I stood there, the salt-stained smell of the docks still clinging to my cheap blazer, and I realized that no amount of profit, no amount of saved millions, and no amount of 90-hour work weeks would ever make me a Sterling in my father's eyes. I was the engine room, hidden, greasy, and essential, while Preston was the flag flying on the mast, useless but celebrated. I watched my father laugh at one of Preston's vapid jokes, the two of them bonded by a shared genetics that I apparently didn't fully possess in the way they deemed important. Barnaby's lack of respect wasn't just an oversight, it was a policy. He had built this empire on the idea of a male legacy, and he was willing to watch it burn to the ground under Preston's incompetence rather than let a woman take the helm. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom as they discussed $50 million cars and $1,000 dinners at Canlis, was that I had spent the last decade learning every single weakness in the Sterling armor. I knew where the bodies were buried in the accounting ledgers. I knew which shell companies were being used to hide Preston's gambling debts in Macau. I knew the precise legal language of the Sterling Trust, a document I had memorized during the many nights I slept on the sofa in my office because I was too tired to drive my dented Corolla home. I was the one who controlled the data, and in the modern world, data was a far more powerful currency than a shark blue Porsche or a gold watch. Every time Barnaby called my career a hobby, I added a new line to my own private ledger of retribution. Every time Preston sneered at my Macy's suit, I found another way to divert my performance bonuses into offshore accounts they didn't know existed. I wasn't just managing a fleet of ships, I was building a life raft for myself, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. The financial gap was a canyon, yes, but I was the one who knew how to build the bridge. As I walked out of that office and headed back to my desk to finish a report on the $0.04 per gallon fuel discrepancy, I didn't feel like a girl with a hobby. I felt like a general preparing for a war that my father and brother were too arrogant to even realize had already begun. The silence of my office was no longer a sign of my invisibility. It was the quiet before the storm that would eventually strip the sterling name of everything but its shame. I looked at the dented bumper of my car in the reflection of the glass and smiled, knowing that the person who drives the cheapest car often has the most to gain when the world finally realizes who has been holding the wheel all along. I was Skylar Sterling, the invisible backbone, and I was about to prove that a backbone is a lot harder to break than a spoiled son's ego. The air in the penthouse boardroom of the Sterling Plaza was thick enough to choke a commoner, a suffocating blend of expensive Cuban cigar smoke and the heavy, cloying scent of Tom Ford Oud Wood cologne that my brother, Preston, applied as if it were a shield against his own inadequacies. It was exactly 11:03 a.m., a time I noted on the digital wall clock synchronized with the New York Stock Exchange, marking the precise moment when the betrayal finally reached its jagged, ugly peak. The boardroom was a monument to excess, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, though the atmosphere inside was far colder than the gray mist rolling off Puget Sound. Preston was draped across a vintage Herman Miller Eames executive chair, his feet, shod in $2,000 bespoke Berluti loafers, resting callously on the surface of a mahogany table that had been polished to a mirror finish and was valued at a conservative $20,000. He looked at me with a jagged, predatory grin, the kind of expression a man wears when he thinks he has already won a game he doesn't realize is still in the first quarter. "The empire is mine, Skylar," he laughed, the sound vibrating with a hollow, metallic triumph that echoed off the sound-dampened walls. "You get this." With a flick of his wrist that was meant to be casual but was laden with a decade of suppressed sibling rivalry, he tossed a small, heavy envelope at my chest. It struck my blazer and fell onto the carpeted floor, landing near my sensible, worn heels like a piece of discarded trash. Around the table, the 7 members of the board of directors, men who looked like clones of one another in their $5,000 Brioni suits and Patek Philippe watches, didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. They looked at their manicured nails, adjusted their silk ties, or worse, they laughed along with my brother, their chuckles sounding like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. They had already been bought and paid for by Preston's promises of increased dividends and a hands-off management style that would allow them to continue their leisurely lifestyle on the company's dime. I felt a surge of heat rising in my chest, a molten core of indignation that threatened to break through my carefully constructed facade of professional indifference, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I reached down and retrieved the envelope from the floor, my fingers grazing the thick, cream-colored cardstock that felt cold to the touch. The envelope was secured with a 30-year-old red wax seal embossed with the Sterling family crest, a stylized anchor that looked more like a hook than a symbol of stability. My hands did not shake as I broke that seal. There was no tremor of fear or uncertainty in my movements because I was the only person in that room who actually understood the ground we were standing on. While Preston was busy networking at the Augusta National Golf Club and the board members were discussing their offshore tax havens, I had spent my weekends in the basement archives of the King County Records Office, meticulously reading every page of the company's original founding charter from 1996. I knew exactly what was inside this envelope because I had found the shadow of its existence in the footnotes of a long-forgotten maritime insurance filing. I knew that my father, Barnaby Sterling, in his infinite arrogance and secret guilt, had left a dormant clause that acted like a landmine buried under the foundation of his own dynasty. As the wax snapped under my thumb with a sharp, final sound, the board members began to murmur, their voices a low drone of condescension. One of them, a man named Alistair, who had served as my father's primary legal counsel for 20 years, checked his Rolex and sighed audibly, as if my presence were a tedious formality that was delaying his lunch at the Rainier Club. But as I pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The smell of the oud wood cologne seemed to sour, and the smug expression on Preston's face began to falter at the edges, replaced by a flicker of confusion as he realized I wasn't crying or pleading for a severance package. The document was not a will or a letter of termination. It was a formal invocation of Article 12, Section 4 of the 1996 Charter, a clause that specified that in the event of a leadership transition, the Chief Operations Liaison, the role I had held while being mocked as a hobbyist, had the unilateral right to audit the personal expense accounts of any incoming CEO prior to their official confirmation. I watched as Preston's feet slowly slid off the $20,000 mahogany table, his posture stiffening as the legal weight of what I was holding began to register. He had spent the last 3 years treating the company's auxiliary accounts like his personal ATM, and I had the spreadsheets, the receipts, and the digital footprints to prove that he had misappropriated over $14 million for his private indulgences, including that shark blue Porsche and a series of questionable real estate ventures in the Caymans. The board members were suddenly very still, their manicured hands hovering over their leather-bound notebooks. I didn't say a word at first. I simply laid the paper on the table and slid it back toward Preston, echoing the gesture he had made only moments ago. The contrast was stark, his $12 ballpoint pen versus my cold, hard evidence of corporate embezzlement. I remembered the nights I stayed until 2 a.m., my eyes burning from the glow of the monitors as I tracked the 4-cent per gallon fuel discrepancies that were actually disguised kickbacks to Preston's shell companies. I remembered the smell of the cleaning solution the janitors used as they worked around me, the only people in this building who ever acknowledged my hard work with a nod of respect. Now, let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday in April of 2021, when I first discovered the discrepancy in the Sterling Mariner's dry docking fees in Singapore. I had brought it to my father's attention, but he had dismissed me with a wave of his hand, telling me that I lacked the big-picture vision required for executive leadership. He was too blinded by his desire for a male heir to see that his golden son was systematically dismantling the empire he had built. That was the day I stopped being just a loyal employee and started being a strategist. I realized that if they were going to treat my life's work as a hobby, I would turn their life's work into my own personal courtroom. But I am getting ahead of myself, because the true weight of this moment wasn't just about the money, it was about the fundamental shift of power. Preston looked at the document, his face turning a shade of purple that almost matched the silk lining of his blazer, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The board members, sensing a shift in the wind as only career sycophants can, began to exchange worried glances. Alistair, the attorney, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the legal language I had unearthed. He knew as well as I did that the charter was ironclad and that my father's own paranoia had provided me with the weapon I needed to destroy his chosen successor. The room felt smaller now, the high-gloss mahogany table no longer a symbol of Preston's authority, but a barrier between him and the consequences of his greed. I looked at the $230,000 Porsche sitting in the garage 40 floors below us, and I thought about my dented Toyota Corolla. I thought about the $120 Macy's suit I was wearing, and how it felt more like armor than any $5,000 Brioni ever could. I wasn't the invisible backbone anymore. I was the architect of their collapse. Every spreadsheet I had managed, every logistics report I had filed, and every 4-cent calculation had been a brick in the wall I was now closing around them. The betrayal had peaked at 11:03 a.m., but the retribution was just beginning. I watched as Preston finally found his voice, though it was high-pitched and cracked with panic. "This is a fake," he stammered, his fingers trembling as he clutched the paper. "You're just a girl with a hobby, Skylar. You can't do this." But the board members weren't laughing anymore. They were looking at the claws, then at Preston, then back at me. They were sharks, and they could smell the blood in the water. They knew that if I moved forward with a formal audit, their own complicity in Preston's spending would be laid bare for the SEC to see. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, and I smoothed the front of my clearance rack blazer. I didn't need to yell or scream. The truth was written in 12-point Times New Roman font on a piece of yellowing parchment, and it was louder than any roar from a Porsche engine. Family isn't about blood or names on a building. It's about who actually keeps the lights on when the storm hits. My father and brother had spent 30 years trying to make me feel small, but they had accidentally given me the keys to the entire kingdom by leaving me in the shadows where I could see everything they were hiding. As I turned to leave the boardroom, I didn't look back at the view or the mahogany or the broken men in expensive suits. I looked at my watch, a simple, functional piece that kept perfect time, and I knew that the era of the golden sun was officially over. The ghost of Sterling Oceanic had finally come to collect the debt, and I intended to charge a very high rate of interest. The air inside the rusty anchor was thick with the scent of stale hops, cheap floor cleaner, and the lingering grease of 1,000 deep-fried shifts, a far cry from the pressurized, scent-controlled environment of the Sterling Plaza penthouse. I sat in a dimly lit booth in the far corner, the cracked vinyl of the seat sticking slightly to my trousers as I leaned over a small, wobbly table that had likely never seen a polishing cloth in its 30-year history. Here, in this sanctuary of the overlooked, the coffee tasted like burnt rubber and industrial-grade bitterness, served in a chipped ceramic mug for exactly $2.50, a price I paid with a handful of loose change I found in the bottom of my bag. It was a humble setting for the dismantling of a multi-million-dollar empire, but it was the only place where I felt I could breathe without the suffocating weight of my father's expectations or my brother's unearned arrogance pressing down on my shoulders. I reached into my bag and pulled out the document I had liberated from the boardroom, laying it out carefully on a series of grease-stained napkins I had scavenged from the dispenser to protect the yellowing parchment from the sticky residue of the table. With a steady hand, I took a pen, not the $12 insult Preston had thrown at me, but a reliable black ink rollerball, and drew a jagged, definitive line down the center of a clean napkin. On the left side, I wrote the word blood in thick, heavy letters, and on the right, I wrote business. These were the two pillars upon which the Sterling name had been built, yet they were now the very forces tearing it apart at the seams. For my father, Barnaby, and my brother, Preston, blood was a shield used to protect incompetence and a weapon used to demand a loyalty I had never been given in return. Preston had chosen blood, banking on the idea that being a son was a permanent insurance policy against his own greed and stupidity, while I was left to realize that blood was nothing more than a biological coincidence that had kept me enslaved to a family that viewed me as a utility rather than a person. As I stared at that line, I chose the law, because the law didn't care about who shared whose DNA or who had been born with the right anatomy to inherit a shipping company. The law only cared about the ink on the charter and the 1996 mandates that I had memorized while my family was busy ignoring my existence. The clock on the wall, a neon-fringed Budweiser sign that hummed with a low-frequency buzz, ticked toward 2:14 a.m., the quietest hour of the night when the rest of the city was asleep and the ghosts of my past felt most present. I opened my laptop, the screen's harsh blue light illuminating the shadows of my face and casting a long, distorted reflection against the darkened window of the booth. The cursor blinked with a rhythmic, demanding persistence, a digital heartbeat waiting for me to take the final step that would change everything. In that moment of absolute clarity, the realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I didn't owe them my loyalty, and I certainly didn't owe them my silence. I had spent 10 years being the backup daughter, the person who fixed the mistakes, the person who calculated the 4-cent fuel margins, and the person who ensured the Sterling Titan didn't sink while the men at the helm were busy drinking $800 bottles of Cristal. I had been the invisible ghost in the machine, but the ghost was finally tired of haunting the halls and was ready to tear the building down. I thought back to all the times I had been passed over, like the Christmas dinner in 2018 when Barnaby announced Preston's promotion to executive vice president, while I was literally on a conference call with a port authority in Dubai, resolving a $20 million customs holdup. I remembered the way the light caught the gold leaf on the china as they toasted to Preston's future, while my seat remained empty, my dinner growing cold and forgotten. I realized then that my loyalty had been a one-way street leading straight into a dead end, a sacrifice made at the altar of a family that didn't believe I belonged at the table. I wasn't the backup daughter anymore. I wasn't the safety net or the contingency plan. I was the storm that had been brewing in the shadows of their neglect, a hurricane of data, legal clauses, and decade-long resentments that was about to make landfall on their carefully manicured lives. The internal echo of my father's voice, calling my career a hobby for a girl, played on a loop in my mind, but instead of the usual sting of hurt, it now provided the fuel for my resolve. I began to type, my fingers moving with a surgical precision as I drafted the formal petition for the audit of Preston's auxiliary accounts, citing Article 12, Section 4 of the founding charter. I included the specific transaction IDs for the $14 million he had siphoned into his private offshore ventures, the exact dates of his misappropriated travel expenses, and the evidence of the kickbacks disguised as dry docking fees. Each keystroke was a declaration of independence, a brick removed from the foundation of the Sterling Plaza and added to the monument of my own justice. I wasn't just filing a legal document. I was rewriting the narrative of my life, stripping away the labels they had forced upon me and replacing them with a truth they were too arrogant to see coming. The smell of the burnt coffee seemed to sharpen my senses, the bitterness a reminder of the reality I had lived in while they enjoyed the sweetness of unearned wealth. I looked at the grease-stained napkin again, the line between blood and business looking more like a border between two warring nations. Preston had assumed that because we were family, I would protect him from the consequences of his own embezzlement, that I would value the sterling name over the sterling integrity. He was wrong. I valued the work, I valued the truth, and I valued the 900-hour work weeks that had given me the knowledge to destroy him. My father had spent 30 years building a legacy based on the assumption of a male heir, but he had accidentally built a fortress for me by leaving me in the basement to learn how the plumbing worked. Now I was going to flood the house. As the cursor continued to blink at 2:14 a.m., I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, the kind of calm that only exists in the eye of a hurricane. The 2016 Toyota Corolla with the dented bumper was parked outside, a humble chariot compared to Preston's shark blue Porsche, but it had brought me to this moment of reckoning while his luxury vehicles had only led him into a trap of his own making. I was about to trigger a forensic accounting investigation that would not only strip Preston of his inheritance, but would also expose the board members who had looked at their manicured nails while I was being humiliated. They thought I was a girl with a hobby, but they were about to find out that I was the most dangerous person in the room because I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the truth. I hit the send button, the soft click of the key sounding like a gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. The email containing the evidence and the invocation of the charter was now on its way to the SEC, the major shareholders, and the Internal Compliance Office. There was no going back now. The first cracks were appearing in the Sterling Empire, and I was the one holding the sledgehammer. I closed my laptop and took a final sip of the lukewarm, rubbery coffee, savoring the harshness of it. Family isn't just a name or a shared history of holiday dinners. It is a contract of mutual respect that they had breached a long time ago. I stood up from the sticky vinyl booth, leaving the grease-stained napkin and the broken wax seal behind, and walked out into the cool, damp night of the Seattle docks. The storm was no longer coming. It was here, and I was the one directing the wind. My name is Skylar Sterling, and for the first time in 29 years, I am exactly who I was always meant to be. The invisible backbone had finally stood up straight, and the world was about to hear the sound of the Sterling legacy snapping in half. The weight of the war I had declared began to take a physical toll, manifested in the cold, hard currency of my own survival as I withdrew exactly $18,650 from the secret savings account I had meticulously built over a decade of disciplined frugality. This was my war chest, the money I had saved by driving a dented Toyota Corolla and wearing clearance rack blazers while my brother, Preston, burned through millions on custom Porsche builds and Vacheron Constantin watches. I didn't spend it on a vacation or a luxury. I spent it on Dominic Vane, a man whose reputation in the world of forensic auditing was spoken of in hushed, fearful tones in the back rooms of the New York Stock Exchange. Dominic worked out of a windowless office in a pre-war building near the Seattle waterfront, a space that felt like a sensory overload of strong, bitter espresso and the dusty, metallic scent of old paper. There were no mahogany tables or Herman Miller chairs here. Instead, the room was filled with humming server towers and stacks of cardboard banker's boxes that reached toward the exposed pipe ceiling. Dominic himself was a man of sharp angles and relentless focus, his eyes shielded by thick glasses that caught the glare of 3 different high-resolution monitors as he welcomed me into his sanctuary of numbers. We spent 96 hours straight buried in that windowless bunker, a period of time where the sun became a theoretical concept, and the only measure of existence was the steady progression of data points across a digital landscape. We were cross-referencing over 2,400 pages of offshore wire transfers, a labyrinth of financial deception that Preston had assumed was too complex for anyone to ever unravel. My role was to provide the institutional knowledge, the context for every 4-cent per gallon discrepancy I had flagged over the years, while Dominic provided the surgical precision to trace those leaks back to their source. The air in the office grew stale, the scent of the espresso turning from a stimulant into a thick, oily presence that coated my throat. But we didn't stop because we were finally seeing the outline of the monster hiding in the Sterling ledgers. We were looking for the needle in the haystack of a $150 million empire, and every time my eyes began to burn from the blue light of the screens, I thought about the $12 ballpoint pen Preston had thrown at my chest, and the heat of the indignation would flare up again, keeping me awake for another 6 hours. The breakthrough happened at 3 a.m. on the 4th day, a moment defined by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Dominic's keyboard suddenly coming to a halt. He leaned back, the springs of his battered office chair groaning under the weight of his triumph, and pointed to a specific sequence of hexadecimal codes on the center monitor. We had found it. Audit Trail X-99, the digital skeleton key that unlocked the entire mystery of the Sterling Oceanic auxiliary accounts. Preston hadn't just been skimming off the top. He had been siphoning exactly $212,500 every single month with the mechanical regularity of a heartbeat. The money was being funneled through a series of increasingly opaque shell companies, first a logistics firm in Panama, then a maritime insurance consultancy in Cyprus, before finally landing in the accounts of a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under the innocuous name of Blue Horizon Holdings. As I stared at the numbers, the sheer scale of the betrayal crystallized in my mind. This wasn't just corporate mismanagement. It was a systematic looting of my father's legacy to fund a private, self-destructive obsession. Through the decrypted chat logs that Dominic had managed to harvest from a secure server used by the Cayman entity, we discovered the dark reality of Preston's double life. He wasn't the visionary investor my father believed him to be. He was an addict, a man who spent his nights participating in underground, high-stakes poker games where the buy-ins alone were $50,000. The chat logs were filled with his desperate negotiations, his arrogant boasts, and the cold, hard evidence of him pledging Sterling Oceanic assets as collateral for his mounting gambling debts. I saw the IP addresses linking the transfers directly to his penthouse in the Sterling Plaza, a trail of breadcrumbs that even the most expensive lawyers in Seattle wouldn't be able to scrub away. But the most devastating weapon in my arsenal wasn't the financial data or the chat logs. It was a single, overlooked document I had found in the very back of the 1996 Trust Amendment, a piece of paper that Barnaby Sterling had signed during a period of extreme moralistic fervor following his own father's scandalous demise. The amendment contained a specific, ironclad clause that prohibited any primary heir from assuming control of the trust if they were found to have engaged in acts of moral turpitude, specifically listing illegal gambling and the embezzlement of company funds as grounds for immediate and irrevocable disqualification. My father had built this trap for the ghosts of his past, never realizing that he was setting it for the son he adored. By siphoning those $212,500 every month, Preston hadn't just stolen money, he had triggered a legal suicide switch that would strip him of his inheritance, his title, and his name. I felt a strange, cold shiver of satisfaction as I held the printout of the amendment in my hands, the paper still warm from the laser printer in Dominic's office. For 10 years, I had been the invisible backbone, the girl with the hobby who was only suited for the mailroom, while Preston was the golden prince who could do no wrong. I had worked 90-hour weeks to ensure the company remained profitable, saving pennies on fuel logistics while my brother was throwing away millions on the turn of a card. The contrast was no longer just a source of personal pain, it was the foundation of his downfall. I had the IP addresses, I had the decrypted logs, and I had the law, a trifecta of truth that was about to collide with the $150 million lie my brother had been living. Dominic looked at me, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, but his eyes shining with the respect of one professional for another. He knew what I was about to do. "This is the end for him, Skylar," he said, his voice raspy from the espresso and the silence. "There's no coming back from X-99. This isn't just an audit, it's an execution." I nodded, the weight of the realization settling into my bones. I wasn't just reclaiming my place in the company, I was dismantling a dynasty that had been built on a foundation of sexism and favoritism. My father, Barnaby, had ignored my spreadsheets because he couldn't see past my gender, but those very spreadsheets had now become the evidence that would prove his chosen heir was a thief and a fraud. I left the windowless office at dawn, the sky over the Seattle waterfront a bruised purple and gray. I walked toward my 2016 Toyota Corolla, my movements steady and purposeful. The $18,650 I had spent was the best investment I had ever made, a small price to pay for the justice that was now within my reach. I thought about the 2026 Porsche in shark blue and the Vacheron Constantine watch, and I realized they were nothing more than shiny trinkets bought with stolen time and embezzled dreams. Preston had chosen blood and the assumption of immunity, but I had chosen the meticulous, unyielding path of the law. As I started my car, the engine turning over with a reliable hum, I knew that the next time I entered the Sterling Plaza, I wouldn't be the daughter looking for approval. I would be the storm that would sweep away the debris of my brother's greed and my father's pride. Now, let me take you back to a rainy night in 2015, the first time I noticed a $500 discrepancy in the petty cash account at the Savannah docks. I had brought it to the office manager who told me to let it go, that it was probably just a rounding error. I didn't let it go. I recorded it in a small black notebook that I still carry in my satchel. That $500 was the first drop of rain in the hurricane I was now bringing home. I realized then that an empire doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, one small betrayal at a time, until the foundation is nothing but dust. Preston had been eroding the Sterling name for years, and I was simply the one who had finally bothered to measure the damage. As I drove through the empty streets of the city, the skyscrapers reflecting the first light of the morning, I felt a profound sense of closure. The invisible backbone was no longer hidden. I was the person who knew where every cent was buried, who understood the mechanics of the 1996 trust, and who possessed the evidence of the X-99 audit trail. Family isn't about protecting the person who shares your blood while they burn the house down around you. Family is about the integrity of the legacy and the hard work required to maintain it. I was a Sterling by birth, but I was a leader by merit, and the two were finally about to align in a way that would change the maritime industry forever. The $18,000 was gone, but in its place, I held the keys to a $150 million truth. The storm was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was the air I was breathing, and by the time the markets opened at 9:30 a.m., the Sterling Tower would realize that the girl from the mailroom was the only one left who knew how to sail the ship. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Seattle was a shimmering, suffocating veil of luxury, vibrating with the practiced laughter of 215 elite guests who had gathered to celebrate the Sterling Oceanic 30th Anniversary Gala. The room was a masterclass in excess, illuminated by the cold, crystalline glow of massive Swarovski chandeliers that cast sharp fractals of light across 14 crates of vintage Moet and Chandon Brut Imperial, their gold-foiled necks peeking out from silver basins filled with crushed artisan ice. At the center of the buffet stood a $5,000 ice sculpture of our flagship cargo ship, the Sterling Titan, its frozen hull beginning to weep droplets of water onto a bed of imported orchids. My brother, Preston, stood on the elevated mahogany stage beneath a spotlight that seemed to adore him, accepting a glass of champagne from the mayor while wearing a smirk that suggested he had personally birthed the maritime industry. He looked every bit the golden heir in his charcoal velvet dinner jacket, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who believed his bloodline was a bulletproof vest against the consequences of his own rot. I arrived at exactly 10:22 p.m., timed to the precise moment when the gala's momentum was at its peak and the room was most vulnerable to a sudden change in atmosphere. I didn't enter through the service doors this time. I walked through the main mahogany entrance, the heavy brass handles feeling cold and solid beneath my palms. I was wearing a bespoke black wool and silk tuxedo dress from a private atelier in Pioneer Square, a garment that had cost me exactly $4,800, my first real victory purchase, funded by the very performance bonuses I had clawed out of the company's tight-fisted accounting department. The dress was a sharp architectural masterpiece that hugged my frame like armor, its silk lapels catching the light as I moved with a deliberate, predatory grace that I had never allowed myself to show in the office. For the first time in 29 years, I didn't look like the backup daughter or the mailroom clerk. I looked like the person who owned the air everyone else was breathing. In my right hand, I clutched a high-capacity, military-grade Kingston Iron Key USB drive, its brushed steel casing feeling heavy and warm, like a detonator waiting for the final countdown. This wasn't just a storage device. It was the payload of 96 hours of forensic auditing, containing the X-99 audit trail, the decrypted chat logs of Preston's gambling debts, and the original 1996 trust amendment that acted as his legal death warrant. As I walked down the center aisle, the clicking of my heels on the polished marble floor sounded like the ticking of a clock in a silent room. The conversations died away in waves, a sea of $5,000 Brioni suits and silk evening gowns parting to let me through, as the guests realized that the invisible Sterling daughter had finally stepped into the light. I could see my father, Barnaby, sitting at the head table, his glass frozen halfway to his lips as his eyes narrowed in a mixture of confusion and burgeoning paternal rage. Preston saw me then, his smug expression flickering for a fraction of a second before he recovered, masking his panic with a loud, booming laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Skylar! You're late to your own family's triumph!" he shouted into the microphone, the feedback whining through the room's high-end Bose sound system. "Don't worry, we saved you some of the cheap stuff in the back." The board members laughed, a dry, sycophantic sound that grated against my nerves, but I didn't break my stride. I bypassed the panicked AV technician who tried to intercept me near the sound booth, stepping behind the console with the authority of someone who had spent a decade mastering the logistics of much more complex systems than a gala presentation. I didn't wait for an introduction or a permission that would never come. I reached out and plugged the steel drive directly into the main projector's interface, the blue light of the connection glowing like a spark in the dimness of the ballroom. The room went into a state of absolute vacuum-sealed silence as the massive 100-foot screen behind Preston, which had previously been displaying a montage of Sterling cargo ships sailing into sunsets, flickered and died. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screen was a void of blackness, and then, with the suddenness of a lightning strike, Audit Trail X-99 bloomed across the surface in stark, high-definition clarity. The spreadsheets were massive, the numbers glowing in surgical white against a deep blue background, showing the mechanical regularity of the $212,500 monthly transfers to Blue Horizon Holdings in the Cayman Islands. I watched the color drain from Preston's face, the tan he had cultivated on the deck of a yacht in Monaco evaporating to reveal a sickly gray pallor that made him look 20 years older in an instant. The mayor stepped back, slowly setting his glass down as if it had suddenly turned to lead, and the silence in the room became so heavy it felt like it might collapse the floor. I didn't need a microphone to be heard. The data was shouting for me. I began to scroll through the decrypted chat logs, the words appearing in giant, jagged font above my brother's head, detailing his desperate pleas for more credit at the poker tables and his promises to use Sterling Oceanic's maritime insurance bonds as collateral. Every guest in that room, from the city's most powerful bankers to the journalists from the Seattle Business Journal, saw the reality of the Golden Sun's moral turpitude. I looked at my father, Barnaby, whose face had turned from a stoic mask into a map of absolute devastation, as he realized his legacy had been hollowed out from the inside by the person he trusted most. He looked at the screen, then at the son he had championed, and finally at me, the daughter he had dismissed as a girl with a hobby. And for the first time in my life, I saw the flicker of realization in his eyes that he had been betting on the wrong horse for 30 years. I moved the cursor to the final file, the 1996 Trust Amendment, specifically highlighting the clause regarding the immediate disqualification of any heir found guilty of embezzlement or illegal gambling. The legal language was cold and final, a series of sharp, uncompromising sentences that stripped Preston of his CEO title and his $150 million inheritance before he could even draw his next breath. I stood there, my hand still on the laptop, watching the ice sculpture of the cargo ship melt and drip onto the table, a perfect metaphor for the Sterling dynasty. The trap was sprung, the payload had been delivered, and the invisible backbone of the company had finally snapped the neck of the arrogance that had tried to bury it. I wasn't just the storm anymore. I was the aftermath, the cold, clear light that follows a hurricane, revealing exactly what was left standing when the lies were stripped away. Now, let me take you back to a winter morning in 2022, when I spent 4 hours in a freezing cold shipping container in the port of Tacoma, manually counting a shipment of high-value electronics because Preston had forgotten to sign the manifest and the port authorities were threatening to seize the cargo. My fingers were so numb I could barely hold the clipboard, and the only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that if I didn't do it, no one would. That was the day I realized that the Sterling name didn't belong to the people who inherited it. It belonged to the people who actually bled for it. I had bled for this company in 1,000 small, invisible ways, while Preston had only ever bled it dry. As I stood on that stage at the gala, I didn't feel like a thief or a traitor. I felt like a technician performing a necessary surgery, cutting out a tumor that had been growing in the heart of my father's empire for too long. The gala was over, though no one had officially announced it. The Moet and Chandon was forgotten, the ice ship was a puddle of gray water, and the mayor was already making a quiet exit through the side door to distance himself from the impending scandal. Preston finally turned to look at me, his eyes wide with a feral, cornered terror, his mouth opening to speak a defense that no longer existed. I didn't wait for him to find the words. I simply unplugged the USB drive, tucked it back into the pocket of my tuxedo dress, and stepped down from the stage. I walked past the board members who were now looking at me with a terrified, newfound respect, and I walked past my father, who was staring at the empty screen as if he could still see the ghosts of his mistakes dancing there. I didn't need their approval or their apologies. I had the truth, I had the law, and I had the keys to the kingdom. Family isn't a safety net for the wicked or a blank check for the spoiled. It is a responsibility that must be earned every single day. My father and brother had spent decades treating me like a ghost, but they forgot that ghosts are the ones who know all the secrets of the house. As I walked out of the Four Seasons and into the cool, rain-washed air of the Seattle night, I felt the weight of the last 10 years lift off my shoulders. I was Skylar Sterling, and I was no longer the backbone. I was the head, the heart, and the hands of Sterling Oceanic, and the era of the golden sun was officially dead. I signaled for my 2016 Toyota Corolla, the dented bumper a badge of honor in a world of rented Porsches and stolen dreams. The $150 million was no longer a dream. It was a resource I would use to rebuild the empire into something that actually stood for the values it claimed to possess. The storm had passed, and for the first time in my life, I was standing on solid ground. "Preston, your leadership just ended," I said into the microphone, my voice amplified by the room's high-fidelity sound system, cutting through the thick, panicked silence like a precision-milled blade through silk. I didn't need to raise my voice or shout to be heard over the gasps of the 215 guests because the sheer authority of the truth had already sucked the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. I stood perfectly still behind the AV console, my hands steady as I moved the cursor over the final execution command on the laptop and hit play with a deliberate soft click of the trackpad. The 100-foot projection screen, which only moments ago had been a monument to the Sterling family's perceived stability, suddenly erupted into a flickering mosaic of Preston's darkest secrets, beginning with high-resolution digital bank statements from his Blue Horizon Holdings account in the Caymans. These weren't just numbers on a page, they were a roadmap of betrayal, highlighted by Audit Trail X-99, which showed the mechanical monthly siphoning of $212,500 from our maritime fuel subsidy funds. As the guests leaned forward, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, the screen shifted to granular black-and-white surveillance footage captured by private security cameras in the early hours of various Tuesday mornings. The timestamps on the footage, blinking in a harsh digital green, showed Preston meeting with known illegal bookmakers at 3 o'clock in the morning in the rain-slicked back alleys of the International District. You could see the desperation in the way he adjusted the collar of his expensive coat, the flicker of his lighter as he smoked nervously while exchanging thick manila envelopes for what were clearly high-stakes gambling debts. The image was so sharp, you could see the sweat on his brow even through the low-light lens, a stark contrast to the golden, polished version of the man currently standing on the gala stage. The silence in the ballroom was suddenly punctuated by a sharp, violent crash as a $400 baccarat crystal plate, laden with imported beluga caviar, slipped from a waiter's trembling hands and shattered against the white marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I ignored the chaos and the murmurs of the board members as I opened the final PDF on the drive, a document that had been buried in the archives for nearly 3 decades, the legal clause, 14B of the secret 1996 Sterling Trust codicil. I began to read the text aloud, my voice steady and rhythmic, echoing the cold finality of my father's own legal precautions. I read the final line of our father's secret codicil, a sentence that acted as a hydraulic press against the foundation of Preston's life. If the male heir is found to be a liability to the fleet's integrity through acts of moral turpitude or financial insolvency, the entire voting block of Sterling Oceanic transfers to the secondary heir immediately and irrevocably. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with the weight of 30 years of hidden history, and I watched as the reality of his total displacement began to manifest physically in my brother's appearance. The sweat was now pouring down his face, a frantic, oily sheen that was visibly ruining the knot of his $2,000 Charvet silk tie, the fabric darkening as it absorbed the evidence of his collapse. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from the mayor to the board of directors, looking for a single face that would offer him a lifeline, but he found only a wall of cold, calculated indifference. In the world of high-stakes international shipping, loyalty is a currency that devalues faster than a hyper-inflated ruble the moment the numbers stop adding up. Preston was no longer the golden son, the visionary CEO, or even a member of the social elite. He was a liability, a ghost in his own ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life he had quite literally gambled away. He tried to reach for the microphone to contest the document, his fingers fumbling with the stand, but I had already cut the audio to the stage, leaving him to mouth silent, pathetic excuses to a crowd that had already moved on to calculating how they could stay in my good graces. I saw my father, Barnaby Sterling, sink into his chair, his hands covering his face as if he could hide from the blinding light of the truth I had unleashed. He had built this empire on the pride of a male legacy, but he had accidentally left the keys to the kingdom in the hands of the one person he thought was only fit to sort the mail. Now let me take you back to a humid afternoon in 2017 at the port of Savannah, when I was 21 years old and working a summer internship that my father described as a way to keep me busy. I had found a discrepancy in the docking manifests, a small thing, only $8,000. And when I brought it to Preston, he had laughed and told me that little girls didn't understand how the real world worked. He told me that sometimes you have to pay a premium to keep the gears moving, a euphemism I now realize was his first attempt at hiding his gambling losses. I remember standing in that gravel parking lot, smelling the salt and the diesel, and making a promise to myself that I would one day understand every single gear in the Sterling machine so well that I could stop it with a single finger. That $8,000 lie was the seed that grew into the $150 million reckoning that was currently playing out on the 100-foot screen in the Four Seasons. The board members were now huddled in a frantic, whispered conference at the edge of the stage, their $5,000 Brioni suits looking like funeral shrouds as they realized their own positions were now at the mercy of the girl they had spent a decade ignoring. I moved to the front of the AV station, stepping out from behind the console so that everyone in the room could see the bespoke black tuxedo dress and the person who was now officially the majority shareholder of Sterling Oceanic. I wasn't just the ghost in the machine anymore, I was the machine itself. The IP addresses, the decrypted chat logs, and the 1996 Trust Amendment were not just evidence, they were the new bylaws of the company, and I was the one holding the gavel. I watched Preston stumble off the stage, nearly tripping on the steps he had climbed so confidently only an hour ago, his presence in the room becoming more transparent and insignificant with every passing second. He was a man stripped of his title, his fortune, and his identity, a hollow shell of the shark blue Porsche driving heir he had pretended to be. The legal clause, 14B, was a masterpiece of my father's paranoia, a safety switch designed to protect the Sterling name from the very person he had raised to carry it. As I looked at the giant screen, I saw the faces of the guests reflecting the blue light of the bank statements, their expressions shifting from shock to a grim, predatory respect. They weren't mourning Preston, they were adjusting their loyalties to the new center of gravity. I thought about the 2016 Toyota Corolla with the dent in the bumper sitting in the valet line downstairs, and I realized it was the only thing in this building that wasn't a lie. I had built my life on the reality of hard work, on the calculation of 4-cent fuel margins, and on the relentless pursuit of the truth, while my brother had built his on a foundation of red wax and stolen millions. The $150 million was no longer a weight around my neck. It was a tool I would use to purge the corruption that had nearly sunk my father's legacy. I turned back to the screen and closed the presentation, the ballroom lights slowly coming back up to reveal a room full of people who didn't know whether to clap or run for the exits. I walked toward the head table where my father sat, my heels clicking with a steady, unbreakable rhythm that filled the silence. I didn't need to say a word to him. The look in my eyes told him everything he needed to know. The hobbyist was now the owner, The mailroom girl was now the CEO, and the invisible backbone was finally standing tall. Family isn't about protecting the person who is dragging you into the depths of their own despair. Family is about the integrity of the work and the strength to do what is necessary when the storm hits. My name is Skylar Sterling, and as the clock moved past 11 p.m. on the night of the 30th Anniversary Gala, I finally took the helm of the ship that I had been steering from the engine room for 10 long years. The era of the golden sun was officially over, and the era of the storm had begun. I looked at the shattered crystal on the floor and then up at the empty stage, knowing that tomorrow morning, the first thing I would do was change the name on the door and the locks on the vault. The truth hadn't just set me free, it had given me the world. The collapse of my brother's carefully constructed facade was not a slow erosion, but a sudden, violent structural failure that culminated on a gray, rain-slicked Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m. While I was already seated at the head of the mahogany conference table in the Sterling Plaza, drinking a cup of coffee that actually tasted like victory, Preston was experiencing the first tremors of his new reality at the valet stand of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. I received the real-time notification from our corporate security detail. His American Express Centurion black card, the ultimate symbol of the status he had stolen from me, had been declined with a cold, digital finality. The hotel's payment processor had flagged the account as frozen by court order, leaving him standing in the lobby in a state of visible, stuttering shock while guests in $5,000 suits stepped around him as if he were a piece of discarded luggage. Simultaneously, 3 blocks away, a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was hoisting his custom-ordered 2026 Porsche 911 Turbo S in shark blue into the air, repossessing it as company property purchased with embezzled funds. The mechanical whine of the winch was the final anthem of his reign, a loud public declaration that the golden sun was now just another debtor in a city that had no memory for the fallen. By noon, the legal machinery I had set in motion with the help of Dominic Vane and the 1996 Trust Amendment had ground his life into a fine, inescapable dust. Preston is now facing 3 felony counts of corporate embezzlement and 2 counts of federal wire fraud, charges backed by over 2,400 pages of forensic evidence and the Audit Trail X-99. The King County Prosecutor's Office, sensing a high-profile victory that would define their fiscal year, had already leaked the potential sentencing guidelines to the maritime journals, 12 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The $14 million he siphoned into the Cayman Islands to fund his underground high-stakes poker addiction had become the bars of a cage he had built for himself with every $212,500 transfer. He was no longer a Sterling, he was a case file, a cautionary tale of what happens when a man mistakes his father's favoritism for his own inherent worth. I am now the CEO of Sterling Oceanic, officially confirmed by a board of directors that spent the morning practically tripping over themselves to offer me the very loyalty they had denied me for a decade. I sat in the executive corner office on the 42nd floor, the space Preston had occupied with such unearned arrogance, and I felt the profound weight of the silence. This wasn't a room he had ever truly owned. He had simply been a squatter in a temple built by my labor and my father's paranoia. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray expanse of Elliott Bay, where 3 of our massive cargo ships were currently making their way toward the port of Seattle. I knew their draft, I knew their fuel consumption down to the last 4 cents per gallon, and I knew the names of the captains who had been waiting for a leader who understood the grit of the docks rather than the silk of a pocket square. I wasn't just sitting in a chair. I was presiding over a fleet I had actually built through 10 years of 90-hour work weeks and invisible, bone-deep sacrifice. The air in the office no longer smelled of Tom Ford Oud wood or expensive cigar smoke. It smelled of ozone from the rain outside and the sharp, clean scent of fresh ink on new contracts. I reached for my phone, the screen reflecting the cold light of the Seattle afternoon, and opened the family group chat. A digital space that had been a source of constant humiliation for me, filled with photos of Preston's vacations and my father's praises for his only son. My thumbs were steady as I typed a single final message to Barnaby, Preston, and the aunts and uncles who had laughed when I was told to sort the mail. The locks have been changed. Don't call. I didn't wait for a response, didn't look for the typing bubbles that would surely signify a wave of desperate apologies or furious denunciations. I simply exited the group, deleted the thread, and placed the phone face down on the mahogany table that I now owned by right of law and merit. Now, let me take you back to a freezing January night in 2020, when I was standing on the deck of a barge in the middle of a gale, checking the lashings on a shipment of medical supplies because I didn't trust the third-party contractor Preston had hired at a discount. My face was encrusted with salt, my hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and I was so exhausted I could barely remember my own middle name. I remember looking up at the lights of the city and thinking that if I could survive that night, I could survive anything they threw at me. That was the moment I realized that my value didn't come from my father's approval or my brother's acknowledgement. It came from the fact that when the world was falling apart, I was the one who knew how to hold it together. I had been the invisible backbone for so long that I had forgotten I also possessed the strength of a predator. The transition of power was absolute. I spent the afternoon signing termination letters for the 3 board members who had been most complicit in Preston's embezzlement, their $5,000 Brioni suits no longer providing the protection they expected. I also authorized an immediate 10% pay raise for every dock worker and logistics coordinator in the company, funded by the recovery of the stolen Cayman assets. I was rebuilding Sterling Oceanic not in the image of my father's pride, but in the image of the reality I had lived for 10 years. The $150 million inheritance was no longer a burden of proof. It was the capital required to ensure that no one else in this company would ever be made to feel invisible because of their gender or their lack of a shark blue Porsche. I was the storm that had cleared the rot, and as the evening mist rolled over the bay, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any victory. I walked out of the Sterling Tower at 6 o'clock, bypassing the luxury parking level where the ghost of Preston's Porsche still lingered in the empty space. I walked to the surface lot and climbed into my 2016 Toyota Corolla. The dent in the rear bumper was still there, a jagged reminder of the years I spent being the girl who didn't matter. I started the engine, the reliable hum of the machine a stark contrast to the screaming sirens of the legal chaos I had left behind. I drove through the streets of Seattle, the rain washing away the last remnants of the Sterling Gala's excess, and I realized that I didn't need a Vacheron Constantin watch to tell me that my time had finally come. I had chosen my own future over my family's lies, and the price of that choice, $18,000 in savings and a lifetime of resentment, was the best bargain I had ever struck. As I pulled into my driveway, the headlights reflecting off the modest house I had paid for with my own hard-earned performance bonuses, I thought about the moral of the story I had lived. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and more importantly, family is the integrity you maintain when the people who are supposed to love you are busy trying to erase you. My father had spent 30 years trying to make me a footnote in Preston's biography, but he had accidentally taught me how to be the author of my own destiny. I was no longer Skylar Sterling, the backup daughter. I was Skylar Sterling, the woman who took an empire apart and put it back together with the precision of a master engineer. The legal battle ahead would be long and grueling, a series of depositions and court dates that would keep the Sterling name in the headlines for months. But I was prepared for the marathon. I had been training for this since I was 19 years old, since the first time I realized that if I wanted a seat at the table, I would have to build the table myself. I looked at the dark windows of my home and saw the reflection of a woman who was no longer seeking permission to exist. I had broken the red wax seal, I had exposed the Audit Trail X-99, and I had claimed the $150 million that was my birthright and my earned reward. The era of the golden sun was a memory, a cautionary tale of greed and unearned privilege that would be taught in business schools for decades. The era of the storm was just beginning, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the wind, I was the one who decided which way it blew. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the wet pavement and the salt air, knowing that tomorrow morning I would wake up and sail the fleet I had always been destined to command. My name is Skylar Sterling, and I am finally, irrevocably, home.